Martin. Gosh, I'm really excited to be here. I view the Centre for Muslim Christian Studies as a home from home, so it's an honour to be here with you, and I'm so pleased to see so many guests here that are interested in my research and the experiences that I have to share. So I have some slides, and I've realised that there is one thing that's missing from the slides. So it would be helpful, I think, to just provide some context on it. And that is, what is practical theology? And practical theology is essentially the practice that we do. So it's an area of research that doesn't formally kind of look at texts and do some of the exploration that we do, for example, in Quran Bible studies. It's really about thinking, how are we practicing our faith? So it's moving from literature to the actual doing of it. And there are a number of different definitions that are available for practical theology, but I think the one that really resonates with me most is that it's about the study of specific social structures and individual initiatives within which God's work continues. So God's work of renewal and restitution, and that kind of becomes manifest, and it can be found inside or outside religious institutions. So I thought that might be quite helpful to just provide some context of what practical theology is. So I'm now going to go over to my presentation. And I kind of added this picture to the first slide here because I hope this kind of demonstrates some of the warmth and care and affection that we had as a group within the summer school cohort that I was in. This is actually part from a picture from the weekend follow-up that we did in December, where we were lucky enough to kind of do some really quite amazing visits. So yeah, hopefully you can see the warmth and love and care there. So my thesis is called "This is the Sound of My Soul." And when I started my research in practical theology, I wasn't really exploring belonging and inclusion. My initial intention was to look at the relationship between Islam and positive psychology, but I entered the field and found a place where there wasn't really enough of an understanding of what Islam was within the context of practical theology. But also at the same time, I'm the first Muslim, or on Friday, inshallah, fingers crossed, God willing, I will be the first Muslim in Britain to have a doctorate in practical theology. And so now there are a couple of others that are researching as well, but that kind of gives some context in terms of the position that I was in and the research that I ended up doing. And so what we'll be looking at today is a little bit of the kind of general background in terms of the methodology, the approach that I took. And then I'll be presenting to you some extracts from one of the autoethnographic vignettes that I wrote, and then the analysis or what came out of the analysis. And then hopefully we'll have a conversation regarding some of those pieces. So a little bit about me. I originally trained as an architect. I eventually kind of became a project director in local government, decided to leave that about 12, 13 years ago, and became a business coach and a trainer of coaches. I then kind of moved into a master's in positive psychology, and from there I wanted to really develop that understanding of the relationship between Islam and flourishing and thriving within the Western context. I'm born and raised in London. I lived in Glasgow for 10 years. I've lived in 9 countries, traveled the world for 4. And my family itself, in terms of the extended family is mixed faith. So my husband kind of converted to Islam about 18 months, 2 years before we met. And he's half Scottish, half Welsh. And I think that's important for me to share because it provides some context in terms of my approach to the kind of conversations that we have within the centre, but also in terms of the research that I'm looking to do. And what's useful about having a rich and kind of intercultural understanding is that then feeds into knowing more about yourself and how you can then have conversations with people that are different. I was very blessed to be invited to join the committee at BIAPT, where I am now a trustee, and that happened last February. And I think some of those things actually happened partly as a result of the journey that I took within the field, but also the interactions that I've had that I'm not going to be speaking about here today, but are documented elsewhere in my thesis. So just to kind of give you a bit of a overview in terms of the approach that I ended up taking to the thesis. And Courtney Goto is a very well-known practical theologian from America, and she wrote what I would call a seminal book called Taking on Practical Theology. And this, or I suppose her call is for us to, let me see if this works, for us to kind of, it's a threefold challenge where we undertake, we challenge, and we become. And we're doing that both for ourselves, but also for the context that we're in. And when I kind of take that and apply that to practical theology, essentially in Britain at the moment, it's a very Christian field, and it's making a lot of strives within the kind of Christian variety of communities and the diaspora that exists. However, it's in terms of the aims of practical theology to be very, very diverse, and there's papers by and a lot of papers by Bonnie Miller McLemore in the US, where there's a desperate desire to become inclusive and international, and some of that is kind of missing within the piece that exists in the UK at the moment. And actually I would argue that it's a challenge globally in terms of becoming inclusive and international. And what I'm sharing here is that it's this threefold approach to practical theology that I think serves us as we kind of look to having more open and honest dialogues across faith and also across culture. So the first element of it is very much about taking on, and that's essentially at the heart of the approach. And what I love here is the way that taking on invites us to challenge what's taken for granted in the very way that we do. And that's very much the approach that I wanted to take. So we have a field that sits here. It's doing some really amazing, incredible work. But how much is sitting within groupthink? What is the kind of perception of someone that is fairly new to the field, and what could I add into it? And all of this is with the aim of becoming more ethical and a more loving community. My methodology and approach to this was conversation, and it was essentially one of the kind of aspects of it. And what I love about Stephen Patterson's approach to conversation as a method, and if anyone needs references, I'm happy to share them afterwards. But in his paper, he describes conversation as a model, method, and means. And it's very much about kind of being the beginning and the end, and that we're kind of celebrating and participating in living the relational flow of conversation. So things are constantly evolving. My approach to my research was very kind of constructive and inductive. And so when we look at conversation as that method, it fits in with it quite nicely. And I particularly love the way that he described conversation as a shy, illicit activity, where it's not about kind of, he says, I never found things out and found things in, but more accurately, I find things in between. And it's the in between that's the precise location of the conversation. And so for me, when I think about the discussions and the experience that we had at the summer school, it was very much about that piece of being in between and kind of entering with genuine curiosity and courage. One of the things that I wrote in my conclusion, and I'm kind of sharing here because I think in terms of the flow of today, it's quite useful to know it at the beginning, is that a lot of researchers have really highlighted the importance of living together as a means for how we can get to know each other. And so going to a conference, reading papers, kind of having conversations, that's all incredibly useful and helpful. However, it's the actual experience of living together in a space that's cultivated to have open questions where trust can be built, that then kind of makes the real piece about having a home together. And also, I mean, you know, one of the things that I'll come on to speak about is how if ever I have any challenging questions to ask, then we're still very much in contact, and I can speak to my trusted colleagues and friends and ask them questions about Christianity or their lived experience as Christians in the same way that they can ask me. And that comes from us having lived together. And again, you know, Nicholas Lee, in her wonderful paper, it kind of documents the experience of traveling in Europe in a group of women from the Abrahamic faiths. And I love what she says here in that, you know, we did not simply want to walk together, but to travel together. And I think that is very much the notion of the idea of the summer school and some of what I'm going to be sharing with you today. So I'm going to actually skip over these, but just to kind of give some context quickly, the approach that I took was of autoethnography. It's describing kind of personal experiences and documenting it in writing. There is some challenge as to whether autoethnography is an appropriate methodology, but what we found in Practical Theology is that it's a really useful one because it documents the lived experience and draws some of that out. And as a side note, in some of the work that I'm doing with organisations, what we're finding is that missing piece in terms of really moving the needle in conversations around diversity and inclusion is bringing in lived experience. So for me, autoethnography is a really, really powerful methodology to employ. Courtney Goto, in her book Taking on Practical Theology, invites the approach of critical intersubjectivity. So she presents that as a methodology, and it's really about how we have these conversations with texts that we're reading, with individuals, to kind of bring in an approach of taking on the paradigm. And she describes kind of incorporating discussions regarding power, privilege and oppression in the research process. And so as we do, hold on, my highlight didn't work, of power, oppression and privilege in the research process. And as we do that, it then kind of enables a different kind of conversation. Now, given that my research is a special category, or has been defined as a special category by the University of Glasgow in their ethics, in terms of it's looking at religious belief, it's looking at gender, and it's looking at ethnicity. Plus, I also took a autoethnographical approach and actually liaised with a number of my colleagues in terms of seeking their opinions on some of what I wrote, and then wanted to use their responses within the research and to start to analyze those as well. The ethical considerations were really quite important. And last year, some guidance was issued that said that anonymization is no longer sufficient. So I had to really be quite careful in terms of the approach that I took about disclosing my own thoughts and reflections, and also involving those of other people as well. And so I did quite a detailed analysis of ethics, and really wanted to make sure that everybody was safe, from me to the other participants, but also to the readers. I mean, some of what I'm going to be sharing with you today is incredibly positive. It's a gift to be able to share it with you in this community. But there were also some really challenging experiences that I had that are quite difficult reading. And so it's very much about ensuring that there is a kind of layer of psychological safety that is available. So in the thesis, I tried to take everybody on a journey, so as they would come to places where there was difficult material being shared, actually the kind of planting of the seeds had got them to the point where there was a level of resilience. So readers are ready for hearing some of those experiences. So how did I undertake the autoethnography? I wrote various pieces. I included 8 within the thesis itself. I think in the end I actually wrote about 20. And one of the things that I was very clear about in terms of my approach to writing the autoethnographic vignettes was that I didn't want to kind of go back and self-edit too much, because it loses some of the rawness of the experience, as we will see shortly. And as I was analysing them, I kind of came up with 3 groups of the 8 vignettes that I'd selected. And so the analysis kind of explores 5 key areas. One is an exploration of everyday experiences. 2 was looking at subversion and allyship. And then 3 kind of looked at blind spots and coercive assimilation. And so today what we're going to be doing is really looking at the experiences that I had at the summer school, which it was a real delight for me, and we'll kind of come to see in some ways how accidental that experience was. So what I'm going to do, if you will permit me, is just kind of read out some of the autoethnographic pieces that I had, and then we'll kind of look at some of the analysis. So on the 21st of August 2019, introductions. Why are you here? Another participant at the Muslim Christian summer school asks inquisitively. I honestly do not know, and all eyes are on me. I'm reflecting and notice that it's taken a little bit longer than it should have to answer, and I've created an uncomfortable, palpable silence. Honestly, I'm not really sure. I saw a tweet a couple of days before the deadline, and it looked interesting enough for me to apply, I say. From the looks on my new colleagues' faces, my response seems unsatisfactory. I continue. I'm not really sure. I knew that this was not a traditional interfaith event, and that appealed to me. I was looking for something where there could be real dialogue between people of different faiths. And to be honest, it fit in my schedule. So perhaps the real answer is that God wants me to be here. But I do not know why. I've just surrendered to God's plan. That's it. The 23rd of August 2019, mosque visits. This is not the kind of mosque I've ever been to. Some of the practices are very different. My Muslim colleagues and I attempt to explain these unknown practices to our Christian colleagues. It's odd, because one of the things that unites us as Muslim visitors is the Friday prayer rituals, and these ones are not like ours. We wait outside for the others to leave and unpack what happened as we walk back. The mosque is a really nice place, very welcoming, but something just felt at odds with how I practice. My Christian colleagues start to speak about the colours of the clothing, the difference in age, how they didn't know what to do and what was happening, and I could relate to a lot of what they were saying. Usually, when I go to Friday prayers, I'm very selective about the mosque that I visit, and I'll only attend ones where the prayer is diverse in the congregation and it feels very welcoming. This place was interesting, but it was not my cup of tea. I suppose the blessing of living in London is that there are many mosques to choose from. Towards the end of the summer school, 27th of August 2019, a few of us decide to go for a walk before we go home tomorrow. I haven't joined the daily morning service in chapel as I feel uncomfortable participating in a Christian service. The invitation to go for a walk is a gift. 4 of us saunter in the Oxford countryside reflecting on God's creation, sharing our perspectives on nature and how the Muslim Christian summer school was the interfaith experience we really needed. I feel more able to ask silly questions, I have Christian friends I can ask advice from, and we have a genuine network for discussion. The unanimous decision is that we all feel content, but also challenged by the work that needs to be done. 28th of August 2019. Food. For almost every meal, we have yogurt and honey for dessert. And today, we discuss the symbolism of honey, a holy food item for Christians and Muslims. It's delicious. I feel melancholy. Someone suggests that we commit to having yogurt and honey for dessert after we leave. Collectively, we all cheer in agreement. So I kind of presented 3 extracts for you. There's a lot more in there and so much more to unpack. And I'm going to kind of share with you 3 of the key things that came out of the analysis. And the first one is really about the importance of getting to know each other. So remembering that my thesis title is "This is the Sound of My Soul, a journey into inclusion and belonging in practical theology." That could have never taken place had it not been about the desire for us to get to know each other. And it's twofold. And Willie James Jennings wrote a seminal book which was published a couple of years ago, but it's fascinating the impact that it's had, called After Whiteness. And in that book, he speaks about what whiteness is, what Christianity is, the kind of perspectives of colour in terms of religion. And at the end, I mean, it's almost in the last few pages, he speaks about an interreligious gathering that he attended. And I'm going to read this out because I think it's really, really pertinent to the discussion that we're having today and to some of the work that we're doing. By talking and talking and laughing together, singing and worshipping together, each in our own religious world, yet sharing that world with all the rest of us, belonging was cultivated. Jennings affirms the notion that friendship is the real thing where people open their living to one another, allowing the path of life to crisscross in journeys imagined, as in some sense shared. We need such friendships. And these experiences provide thickness of the unique joy, presented in a clear desire to make a home together. And I think what's clear about the examples that I've presented to you is the importance of what happens when we learn how to interact with each other, and we can then actually genuinely learn to we're actually genuinely able to learn, live and love alongside one another, respecting the fact that we have different ways of life, different religions, different experiences, not expecting any kind of major change, but having the ability to understand one another. And I think that is an absolutely critical thing in terms of the research that I did, I think in terms of the future of practical theology within Britain, and what I absolutely love about my experience within the summer school. So that I think is a key kind of element of the analysis. Second, there's a American pastor called Adam Hurlson, and he wrote a really amazing book called The Holy No: Worship as an Act of Subversion. And his premise is that when Christians say a holy no to oppressions and injustice through worship, what they're essentially doing is becoming closer to God and becoming closer to the true essence of Christianity. And I think that that kind of extends to all of us, to all of our beliefs. So for me, the idea of saying no to something just because everybody else is doing it is a really courageous thing, but it is also in the work of God. So we're not saying that we're going to follow somebody else's practice because it's the norm. We're really looking to explore what is it that we do in order to say no to oppression and injustice and some of the challenges that we face in the world, so that we're able to say, and this is the piece that I've added, so that we're able to say yes to the kind of original aspirations that God has for us. And Hurlson kind of includes a number of really interesting experiences in his book. But for me, one of the key things here is this piece about hospitality and kind of ensuring that we remove the conditions of hospitality. So I included this here because I wanted to share with you that there's some really interesting things that take place in terms of the power dynamics that exist within the relationship of guest and host. And again, when we have interactions with each other, it's kind of thinking, well, are the hosts kind of exploring what is necessary to create an environment that enables one to feel like they are at home, to enable open and frank conversations, or is there an assumption about how we will communicate? And again, I think one of the things that has been done really well is how that space is curated. So not included within the thesis, but I think really significant point here. If I remember back to the summer school, I think at least a day or two was spent kind of reinforcing messages of how we liaise with each other, how we negotiate, how we respect when somebody else is speaking. And those messages, or the seeds of those, were kind of planted a number of times through the whole of the experience. And those reminders are really quite important. And I think that's the piece that created a kind of a very flat hierarchy, so people were all able to speak to each other and to be able to do it with the ambition of understanding each other, and also kind of with the desire and the aspiration of creating a space for all. And I think where one of the things that I found really interesting about Hurlson's work when I was doing my analysis is the distinction in being able to create a space for all versus spaces that are where the aim is to be hospitable, versus spaces where there's kind of like an accommodation. And so there's differences within each of these in terms of how one is able to show up and be their true self and be able to belong. Moving on. The other kind of interesting piece about this is the concept of allyship. And so when we look at allyship, many of us understand what that means. Here, Schultz et al. And actually, I would recommend that's a really, really interesting paper to explore in terms of they've done an analysis. Gosh, I've forgotten the technical name of it, but they did a complete review of all of the papers that are out there exploring allyship, and essentially then decided to describe it as redressing power imbalances between privileged and marginalized groups and individuals, and therefore it's really strongly aligned with qualitative methods based on or founded on social justice. And again, this kind of goes back to why the methodology that I used was really useful in terms of drawing out some of the issues. But also for me, the kind of key thing here about the concept of allyship is that often there's a lot of power that's kind of embedded within that. And here, I think what we're looking to do is to create allied relationships that are equal. And so, simple things, for example, in the way that the summer school is set up of equal numbers of male, female, equal numbers of Christians, Muslim, actually really sets quite a significant framing for the conversation before one even gets into the room, so that there's a real space to be able to be allies for each other. And in their paper, they kind of make 3 suggestions for how we can be strong allies. And it's to move beyond involvement to co-production. And I really, really love that, because when I think about the time at summer school, it was a co-created conversation and a co-created experience. It wasn't really about saying, it wasn't an academic exercise. It was lived and experiential, and I think that's really, really quite powerful. And that's how you develop genuine allyship. So I'm not just reading the experiences of my Christian colleagues, I'm actually able to walk beside them and feel and see what it's like for them. And I haven't shared it with you here, but one of the most profound experiences that I had was when we did a visit to a church, and I watched one of my Christian colleagues worshipping. And in that church, watching him, I felt closer to God, because I was experiencing kind of vicariously the connection to God through him and through watching his joy. And I think that's what is really, really wonderful about these experiences, so that we are able to get closer to God through the journey of being alongside people of different faiths. In terms of allyship, the second thing as well is kind of being more transparent about reporting collaborations. And so in this presentation, there are a number of different angles that I could have taken, but what I really wanted to do here today is kind of to document some of my experiences through the summer school and through the work at the Christian Muslim Centre, because it is essentially reporting a collaboration. We don't have enough of these stories shared. And when one does that, then I think it opens up avenues for other people to be courageous and to do this work. I'm going to come on in a moment to speak about a practical theology of belonging. And when you look at what the components of those are, there's an entry point to all of that, and that is courage. And I think people develop and build courage by sharing. So, for example, for me, I felt confident in terms of writing these autoethnographic pieces, the challenging ones as well as the ones that brought me joy, because I was able to read other people's experiences within the literature. And I think the more that we do that, the more we will create a real sense of belonging and kind of horizontal communications between each other that are essentially life-changing, I would argue. And I think the third piece there as well is that it creates the capacity to enact and to demonstrate and to live and to experience allyship. So it moves from being a theoretical exercise where we speak about being an ally to actually living and being one. And so, for example, some of the conversations that we continue to have within our cohort WhatsApp group are very much around how can we support each other with some of the challenges that we face within our day-to-day work across religion, across culture, across experiences even. And I think that, it really does help to develop that capacity to enact allyship. So in conclusion, just to kind of set the context for the conclusion, in the end, I think I wrote something like 400,000 words of notes for my thesis. There's probably 2 or 3 other theses that I could write just from the pieces that I did not submit. And here, I'm presenting to you maybe 5-10 pages of a 200-page document. So it kind of, and I share that because there's so much complexity behind the notion of what a practical theology of belonging could be. And I think this is an ongoing conversation. So it's really an invitation in some ways to kind of help with the hypothesis that I've created and to unpack some of it. And I'm proposing that this practical theology of belonging is based on compassion, on conversation and collaboration. In terms of compassion, I think the entry point of that is self-compassion. One of the things that we can do is often criticize ourselves for mistakes that we've made, for things that we've not done quite right. But what I found is that when we are having conversations with friends and colleagues of different faiths, if you make a mistake, acknowledge it, be kind, and be compassionate to yourself in the way that you would to somebody else. And I think that's really, really significant in this work. Then I speak about conversation. I think I've kind of shared with you quite strongly why conversation is such a important piece in terms of a kind of approach of belonging and how it can be used as a methodology. And interestingly, I was having a conversation with somebody else about conversation, in that it's a tool that's available to academics, to kind of the corporate the world, but also it's a tool that's available to everybody. It's incredibly accessible, so the notion that we can use conversation as a tool to create belonging, to create inclusion, can happen the minute that you step out of the door or when you go into a really big conference. And so I suppose in terms of further research and work that I'm looking to do postdoctorate, some of it is about conversation as a methodology and how we can kind of have a different conversation in a number of arenas. And then finally, collaboration. And I think it's really important to find collaborative partners that are on the same page as you, or ones that are open to kind of go on a journey. And sometimes we find individuals and organizations that may require a little bit more work, but if you meet them where they are and they're willing to kind of walk with you, I think that's where there's a huge amount of power in terms of the work that can then get done and the impact that it could have. And Anthony Reddy, Professor Anthony Reddy, is one of my supervisors. One of the things that he said way back in 1999 is that in order to move beyond rhetoric, we really want to analyse why things are the way that they are. And I think I kind of extend this as an invitation for all of us to look at the interactions that we're having with each other, with others, and to kind of consider, well, why is it like this? Does it have to be? What could we improve in that? How can we kind of really create more belonging and more understanding and create that space of inclusion? And I think, you know, we can grow by getting to know one another, and it really is about walking side by side in that journey home. And I'm going to end here just on one of Rumi's poems, where he kind of speaks about the space between right and wrong, and I'll just read it out. Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. When the soul lies down in that grass, the world is too full to talk about. Ideas, language, even the phrase each other doesn't make any sense. The breeze at dawn has secrets to tell you. Don't go back to sleep. You must ask for what you really want. Don't go back to sleep. People are going back and forth across the doorsill, where the two worlds touch. The door is round and open. Don't go back to sleep. Thank you.